Welcome and aloha. I'm Mark Shklov, host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Law Across the Sea program. Today we're going across the sea of change with respect to how cannabis is viewed under the laws of the state of Hawaii. My guest is Garrett Halydier, a Hawaii lawyer whose practice includes advising clients in the cannabis industry. Garrett's involvement and knowledge of the cannabis industry is extensive. I've asked Garrett to provide us with a current update of the cannabis industry in Hawaii. Aloha, Garrett. Good to see you. How are you?
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. I'm doing well today.
Now, I want to go into, some details about the current status of the industry, but first I want to ask you a couple basic questions for people like me that maybe don't know a lot about the cannabis industry. First of all, is there any difference between cannabis and marijuana?
Great question, Mark. And that's something from a public education standpoint it's really important to get out there for both your listeners and for people. It's so important that the legislature actually clarified that at some point in the last few years. There is no actual difference between cannabis and marijuana. It's just a difference in terms. Cannabis has been with the human race for thousands of years. And so it's got names from a variety of different cultures. Marijuana is spelled with an H, is the Spanish term for the plant. Spelled with a J is the anglicized version of that. And in the 1910s, 1930s, when we were beginning to crack down on marijuana, it was used to associate cannabis with Mexican immigrants in particular, to cast it in a bad light, if you will. To give the government the ability to crack down on it because it was part of what at the time were considered undesirables as part of their process. Due to that kind of history, there's been a movement within the cannabis industry itself to move away from that term or the use of marijuana in the United States, though it is still called that in Mexico, where they recently legalized it. And so Governor Ige in 2017 recognized this history and signed into law along with the legislature, changing the word marijuana in all of our state legislation and our state administrative rules to the word cannabis, which is closer to the actual scientific term of the plant, either cannabis sativa or cannabis indica.
Okay, so that's interesting. I mean, it's just words. There is no meaningful difference. Okay, all right. Now, taking a look directly at the cannabis industry in Hawaii, what were the legislative origins? What is it? What is the cannabis industry in Hawaii? I mean, as opposed to, I guess, the marijuana industry. It's funny, but I can see that marijuana, the term, was used to avoid maybe a criminal aspect of cannabis, was used maybe to make it a legitimate industry. But in any event, what is the industry in Hawaii? How did we get there? How did we get here? What is the legislative origin?
Great question. So Hawaii has a really interesting history with cannabis. We were the first state in the union to legalize through the legislature medicinal use for patients. So in the year 2000, the legislature allowed patients to get a doctor's certification that they had a qualifying medical ailment, and then they were allowed to grow their own plants at their houses and produce and consume that cannabis to help with their medical issues. This continued until 2015, purely patient grow, when the legislature passed the medical cannabis dispensary program that we're kind of administering right now. In 2015, that allowed for the creation of 8 different dispensary or licenses and a related number of retail organizations. And then the legislatures continued to add on to that program over the years. These dispensaries are what we call vertically integrated. They get to grow, manufacture, and sell medical cannabis to the patients. But you still have to be a patient to go into the dispensaries. You still have to be certified by a qualified physician that you have one of the qualifying ailments or medical conditions.
Oh, we started 20 years ago, and then there was kind of there was some sort of a legalization of marijuana, if you will. Again, you get the term, the word marijuana, and now it's turned into cannabis industry, which apparently in 2015, then is that correct? Is that
Yes.
when it started
Right. That'd be when it became commercialized in Hawaii, right? When we allowed the commercial distribution of it to cannabis patients.
I guess we have to say the legitimate or the lawful
Right.
commercial. Okay.
But only under state law. It is still completely illegal. Everything that they do inside of the cannabis industry is completely illegal under federal law. There's some guidance within the Department of Justice for how much they will actually enforce those laws in states that have a well-run cannabis program that doesn't, market to kids, and a couple of other requirements. But it is still illegal under federal law at this time. The other big move of kind of recent years in Hawaii was in 2019, the legislature did decriminalize possession of small amounts of cannabis for everyone. So instead of getting a misdemeanor or a felony for possessing cannabis, you're only given a fine, just like a traffic ticket or a parking ticket, a $130 fine for possession of up to 3 grams. Distribution, selling, still very illegal, will get you in a lot of trouble. Don't do that. But we have decriminalized it, which is a huge step forward on the kind of social justice and criminalization front for cannabis.
Okay, so it sounds like the cannabis industry that is commercialized is for medicinal purposes and for people that qualify somehow. So what, I can see how it got started. I can see the timeline. Where are we now? I mean, what is the current status? And that's really what I want you to talk about. What is the current status of the cannabis industry in Hawaii today? And then I want to ask you also about what the legislature has been doing and is planning and where is it going. But first, what's the current status today, cannabis industry?
Right. So the cannabis industry in Hawaii, at least as it's administered through the Department of Health, it used to be in the Department of Public Safety from 2000 until 2015. And in 2015, the administration was given to the Department of Health because it is for the patients. It's to provide a medically valuable asset to the patients. And that is how both the legislature and the Department of Health view it. And they're very strong in that view that the reason that we have a cannabis industry is to provide medicine to patients who otherwise aren't getting relief from either traditional medicines or don't want to participate in maybe the opioid economy for some of their conditions. Within that Department of Health, there's 2 programs. There's the registry program, which kind of manages the registration of the patients who are still allowed to grow it on their own. And then there's the dispensary program. And they're all under the Office of Medical Cannabis at the moment. And that office was created, I think, in 2018. It was originally just within the Office of Healthcare Assurance, but it's its own office now. So starting with the registry program, I've got recent statistics from the Department of Health through March of 2021. There are currently 32,000 registered patients in Hawaii. This has grown from about 11,700 in 2015. So it's been expanding kind of rapidly over the years. And that number is in line with what we've seen for medical programs across the country, where about 1.5 to 2.5% of a state's population will usually qualify for a medical cannabis card by the time the program begins to kind of approach maturity. There's approximately 2,600 registered caregivers. These are people who are, not everyone who has a medical cannabis card is capable or physically capable of actually growing their own cannabis, turning it into a usable product. Say if you're elderly or you've got cancer, you're in your last 6 months or something. So there's caregivers also have the ability to kind of do that process or help you through that process. About 200 physicians and APRNs have certified patients in the last 12 months. Any physician or APRN can register with DOH to do this process. And that number has more than doubled in the last 4 or 5 years. Initially, it was a very small number of physicians, and that's why APRNs were actually added, who are willing or able to give cannabis certifications to patients. The average age of a cannabis user in Hawaii is about 50, 49 for females, 51 for males. And males account for about 60% of those patients and females for the rest. The most common kind of condition that cannabis patients are certified for is chronic severe pain, usually associated with some other condition. So most patients often qualify for more than one condition. We do have reciprocity with the medical components of other states. So if you have like a medical certification in another state for a medical issue that will also, it corresponds to one of Hawaii's medical issues, you can transfer that medical or access that medical certification here when you're on vacation or when you're here to visit your family and use that to access a dispensary. But we've only had about 700 out-of-state patients in the 2 years since that program's been evolved. In total, of those 30,000 something patients, about 15,000 are on Oahu, 8,000 on Big Island, 6,000 on Maui, and 2,300 on Kauai. And Oahu has by far seen the largest growth. I know in 2015 when the program first started, of the like 11,000 patients that we had at that time, almost 12,000, Big Island accounted for more than half at that time. It had about 5,000 to 6,000. And it's since continued to grow. I think they're approaching like 6 or 7% of the Big Island population is certified for their medical cards, while Oahu, which has a much larger population, is gradually catching up over time. Now, for the dispensaries.
Go ahead, please, yeah.
Now, for the dispensaries, there were 8 dispensary licenses given. There were 3 on Oahu, 2 on Maui, 2 on Big Island, and 1 on Kauai. They were each initially allowed 2 grow locations and 2 retail locations, though that's since been expanded to, I think, 3 retail locations per license. Over the last few years, they've gradually seen their sales increase. Even though the program started in 2015, I don't think anyone was actually open until 2017. Now, as of 2021, they're averaging about, as an industry, so all 8 licenses, their revenue combined is averaging about $4.2 million a month. In 2020, they were considered essential businesses, and so they continue to see revenue growth. The industry's revenue grew from about $3 million a month at the beginning of 2020 to about $4 million a month at the end. This means at about $4 million a month in revenue, they're selling about 500 pounds of cannabis to patients and paying about $200,000 in GET tax to the state on that revenue each month. The DOH's statistics are interesting, though, in that of that 32,000 patients that are registered in the state, only about 12,000 unique patients actually visit a dispensary each month. They do tend to visit a dispensary on average about 3 times a month, but only about 12,000 patients actually visit a dispensary each month, which means the rest are either not using cannabis or tending to grow it themselves. And from conversations with DOH, it seems that a large proportion of patients do in fact grow it themselves. The dispensaries themselves typically sell a fair amount of raw, usable cannabis. About 50% of their sales are that. About 30% of their sales are extracts. You can use either in vape pens or inhalation devices. And the rest is liquid-infused edibles or pills or topicals or other delivery mechanisms. Right now, there are...
I want to ask a couple follow-up questions. That you raised that came to mind. One is, I can see a patient not wanting to get hooked on some type of drug, and so it's cannabis. Then that's the alternative, and you're not going to get hooked on cannabis. And what besides the chronic pain, what other type of issues would a patient have? And then I also want to ask you, how do you get a dispensary license, and why is it limited? So I'm sorry I got throwing you a whole bunch of questions at once, but I thought of these. So first about the patients.
Right. So in regards to the patients, there was a recent 2017, 2018, the National Academy of Sciences for the U.S. did like a big meta study of all of the cannabis studies that had happened, and they were trying to figure out what sorts of things do we actually have research for, what cannabis is useful for, what do we not have research yet, is it contraindicated for something. Between that study and some other recent studies that have happened since then, we know that cannabis has, I want to say, dependency rate of between like 2 and 9%. As far as addictions go, if you like cold stopped, most people would be off of that addiction within about 2 weeks, like through the withdrawal period, though it is a more minor withdrawal period. But a lot of patients do pursue cannabis because A, it has that lower dependency rate, and B, it actually increases the effectiveness. According to National Academies of Sciences, it increases the analgesic effect of opioids. So if you had back surgery, say, and you were prescribed hydrocodone, you could take cannabis pills along with your hydrocodone. You would be able to take less hydrocodone for the same effect. You would be able to take it over a smaller period of time for the same pain relief and effect. and it actually inhibits some of the addictive natures of those opioids, so that you can actually use it as a way to wean off some of those things over time.
Okay. And now, I mean, if I wanted to start a dispensary, why are there only 8? It sounds like, and what would I have to do? I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of competition then. Is that right? I mean,
There was a lot of competition initially in 2015 for that initial set of licenses, but that was the only time so far that we've actually had the lottery, or not a lottery, it was a merit-based application process to receive one of those licenses. The
and
initial law,
who chose them?
there was a panel of people selected by DOH to evaluate them based on some merits that the legislature set up. I think there were 13 criteria.
Okay.
And there's quibbles that could be had with that process. The original law established 8 initial licenses and then gave DOH the ability to expand that number as it watched the industry grow. And it gave it the ability to expand the number to as many as 1 license per 500 patients, which would be like 60 total licenses, I think, at 30,000 patients. So we're obviously a long way from that. There's a lot of interest both at DOH and in the legislature in kind of making sure that the program works and that they're supporting the current licenses. So there's been a real hesitancy to expand that pool at the moment. And obviously the current licensees have their own interest at heart in advocating for keeping that number small for now, especially while the number of patients is small.
And right now, where is the legislature? I mean, you brought that up. Where has there been? The legislature just ended its session. What happened? Is there any action about cannabis? Where is the legislature going on it? What is that status?
So there's always a lot of cannabis bills in the legislature, especially over the last few years. And they usually fall in like one of kind of 4 different areas. There's the bills supported by the current industry and the Department of Health. And those are usually end up being wrapped up into like an omnibus bill that's like fixes to help the current dispensaries, to help current patients, to help make sure DOH has its funding, those sorts of maintenance ideas. There's usually a fair number of legalization bills. There's always some bills that like want to restrict cannabis. And then there's some either like social equity or kind of like middle ground bills trying to move the industry forward without going all the way to legalization. This last year, due to some kind of either misunderstandings or acrimony, or just not being in agreement between some of the dispensaries and the Department of Health, the omnibus bill, for I think the first time, didn't even pass out of crossover or out of conference at the end of the session. And so the only bill to come out of this particular session was one of the incremental step forward kind of bills. So I think it's SB 1139. Did pass. The governor will probably just let it go into law, and it requests the DOH create a task force to investigate the impact of any future legalization scheme on Hawaii's patients' access to medical cannabis. You'll note the kind of wishy-washiness of that statement. It's not asking for a task force to analyze what would be a good legalization scheme or what the goals of a legalization program should be or how to structure a new legalization industry in Hawaii. It's just what would the impacts be on medical cannabis. So it's really a kind of incremental step forward, and it gives them cover to not have to make a decision for another couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, when the legislature and politicians and attorneys were first talking about legalization of marijuana or cannabis, there seemed to be a lot of excitement and a lot of people talking about it. There were programs put on by the Bar Association and all sorts of educational things out there. What happened? Seems like things cooled down. What is there? I mean, is there a concern about health benefits, or what? I mean, what happened?
There's probably a few different reasons for why like you said, the just expectations for the industry have kind of cooled off over the last few years. Partly is a mismatch between the expectations and reality. The industry itself took a few years to kind of get off the ground. And then, whereas on the mainland, especially with some of the legalization programs, fortunes were being made instantly. The way that our program is structured, being kind of increasingly siloed in the vertical structures, limited to the number of licenses, and heavily regulated at the Department of Health level, in how those dispensaries could operate and how kind of small our patient pool was, especially without access to either legalization or out of state. Most of the dispensaries have not been examples of companies that just took off and made their investors lots of money. Each of the dispensaries had to have an escrow about $1.2 million to qualify for a license. And most of them projected spending about 3 to 5 million in investment back in 2015. Now, most of them have spent 8 to 20 million in investments and are just now beginning to break even, if even that. So, to an extent, there's a fairly significant discrepancy between that expectation and reality. On the legislative side, we've been told since 2015 by legislators that legalization would be here in 3 to 5 years,
Right.
every year. But with the election of Trump, Hawaii's kind of challenging Trump on other issues, there was definitely a reticence to try to expand on this issue because they didn't want to give him, any leverage against the state and some of our other, whether it be environmental or other directions that we were kind of going. There was also a real fear under Attorney General Sessions, who has expressed incredible antipathy towards the cannabis industry, that there was going to be a crackdown and a pullback on some of those memos. And so there was not a lot of impetus at the legislative level for significant change as the program was getting off the ground. And then finally, there's just kind of like advocacy and fundraising burnout. It takes time to keep people's energy up on a particular issue, and especially when they don't see a lot of change or a lot of change that's kind of benefiting, or they feel like they're falling behind what's happening on the mainland sometimes in some states where the programs have moved faster. It can be disheartening for advocates or for the people that they're trying to mobilize to get there. And then within the government itself, there's also a lot of opposition from some of the executive agencies, the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Transportation. All 4 police departments in the counties have all explicitly, they testify against most cannabis bills, except for the restrictive ones, because that's not what they feel is in the best interest of Hawaii's populace right now.
Well, okay, all right. Where are we going? What does it look like for the future of the cannabis industry in Hawaii? And in connection with that, I mean, what is your opinion? Is the cannabis industry something that could be positive and helpful to Hawaii? So first, where are we going? Where do you see us going? What's the future of legislation? What's the future of cannabis industry?
The future in Hawaii right now is, in the short term, going to be likely more of the same. Whether because under the current governor, who's expressed his concerns about the mismatch between state and federal law, and doesn't seem to be in the direction of approving challenges to that right now. So under a new governor, that direction might change. The recent law that did pass, giving us a task force to investigate the impacts of legalization on our medical cannabis patients. I know DOH intends to run with that and try to use it to propose kind of more forward-looking policies for how legalization could work. But it's still an incremental step forward that's going to take a couple of years to work itself out before the House goes with legalization in favor of it. The Department of Health may, in a couple of years, expand the number of licenses, reopen up that merit-based application criteria. They were recently moved to the general fund from the special fund, so they're going to have more positions and more kind of opportunity to shepherd the industry over the next few years as it kind of opens up at a medical level. But legalization is probably still a few years off.
So do you think that Hawaii can benefit from the industry, and that economically and health-wise?
Absolutely. We're already seeing it health-wise. That's why 2%, 2.5% of the population, 30,000 people, are receiving medical benefits from this even now, whether that's for things like cancer or epilepsy, for Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, severe chronic pain, or PTSD or anxiety treatments. It has been a real value to those populations who are experiencing those issues. And it will only continue that even if we move towards legalization, because it gives access to more people who may have concerns about going to the doctor or being on any particular list to get certified for those conditions. It does oftentimes open it up. It's also, as evidenced by the National Academies of Sciences, definitely indicated for like fibromyalgia and sleep aid. So it can definitely improve the health of the islands if more people have access to it. in the same way that kind of decriminalization did. It will decrease incarceration rates in minority populations, which has health benefits for the islands as well. And on the economic side, and I've been writing about this since 2015, states and countries have real opportunities when it comes to creating new industries to create a new industry. Hawaii is very much on the train, or at least the lip service, to wanting to diversify our economy away from tourism with mixed success, at least as far as agriculture goes. This could be a nexus for developing new agriculture technologies, as it's really like indoor, grow with lights, a little bit of water, a highly technical plant to do, as well as some of the production side as well. So we can use it to spur some of that economic growth, as well as actually selling it to tourists, becoming a destination, the ancillary services that might grow up around that to make sure that there are safe places for tourists to use the cannabis. There's a lot of opportunities in that area if that's the direction the legislature wants to go, if they want to tax it to give benefits back to the state, help fix our potholes, pay for schools.
So there is a potential if the people have the eyesight to see that far and go forward. Now, we have a few minutes left. You got involved early in the cannabis industry, and I think out of law school, basically, right? Yeah, and
Yes.
I'd like to ask you a personal question. I mean, what have you learned about life and the practice of law from your involvement with the cannabis industry in Hawaii? What is it? What have you been taught, or what has it taught you?
I've learned a number of things. First, being open to opportunities as they present themselves, especially when some other people may be hesitant. The legal profession in Hawaii has not embraced cannabis with open arms, though they have made strides. It's now definitely ethical under some changes to the ethics rules that we can advise on how to comply with state and local cannabis laws. So I've learned to be open to those opportunities, but also, be cautious in accepting them, going all in, take an approach that is balanced, and at least in the cannabis industry, patient-centric has been important. I've learned to talk to people. Everyone has their stories, and there's ways to create common ground, but that starts with listening instead of speaking. And I think that this has been really valuable in my own law practice, as well as working as an advocate in the cannabis industry and with the legislature.
And so you plan to continue in that vein, in that industry. What other areas of law are you involved in?
Absolutely. So definitely still doing legal work for the cannabis industry, because it's kind of a small industry. There's not always work on the business side of it, but I do consulting for other law firms when they've got like a cannabis employment issue or a cannabis criminal law issue, to kind of say, hey, or a cannabis housing issue. Here's how cannabis laws interact with the state laws on this particular issue. And then I've been teaching at the law school at Richardson. I taught a cannabis class there. And I'm looking forward to doing some writing and publishing on this idea of how do states or countries develop diversified cannabis industries that are beneficial to the patients, beneficial to the government, and beneficial to the people of Hawaii.
Well, I appreciate your time today and giving us the current update, Garrett. Good to hear this, and I suspect that there will be more things happening in the future in the cannabis industry. And I look forward to talking to you again. So, Garrett, thank you very much. Aloha. We'll hear from you again, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark.